You tell me when, Mark. Are we ready? We live? All right. Well, we survived the first week, right? And I've heard from some of you that the reading is a little heady, and it is. It gets a little more relatable when we get really into the kingdom period, the United Kingdom and the divided kingdom period, which is really the highlight of the course. We really get to tear into the Bible then. The problem with today's subject, the Patriarch period, is that of all the time periods we're going to study in the history of ancient Israel, you'll remember last week we talked about 4 divisions in the history of ancient Israel. We had the Patriarch period, followed by the Judges period, followed by the Monarchy period, which has both the united and the divided monarchy, and then followed by the Babylonian exile. Well, today we're going to take on the Patriarch period, and the reason I say that it's kind of the most difficult to teach is because the almost only information we have about the Patriarch period comes from the Bible. Whereas in the other time periods, not so much in Judges, we're just going to spend 1 week in Judges next week, but definitely when we get to the kingdom period, both the united and divided kingdom, we start to see a lot of other sources appear, other nations making more references to what's going on in Israel, and it really augments the picture that we get to look at. And remember, this is not a traditional Bible study where we're going to summarize the biblical narrative. I'm going to assume that you know about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Joshua, ultimately, the people that we're going to be working through for the next couple of weeks. So it's not my goal to go in and re-examine all the stories and do sort of a exegetical evaluation where we're going to just extract things from those stories.
And if you do want to learn those things, come Wednesday mornings at 8 o'clock.
There you go, because that's what they're doing Wednesday morning in a more regimented Bible study. We are looking for the context. We are looking for the background and the information that helps, remember the term we used last week, illuminate a Bible study like that, so that you can better understand where God was coming from and what he was wanting us to know. And again, it's like put on your ancient hats. Let's try to understand this in the context. How would the Jews have understood this? We're going to look at a couple examples today, later on, that I think will not only show you how the Jews might have looked at an incident, but also, in this case that I'm going to use, how the Egyptians might have looked at an incident because it was happening to them. So it'll start to get a little bit interesting wise. Israel itself is one of the smaller countries in the pre-Christian era. It's significant to us, but it wasn't overly significant in the history of the ancient Near East. It was not as powerful. It was not as significant in the ancient Near East as say, Babylon or Assyria. These great empires that conquered these vast amounts of land. Israel is weak. And we always have to remember that, because sometimes when we read the Bible, since it is Israel-centric in the Old Testament, it's talking about Israel, we kind of get the misimpression that Israel was a strong nation. It wasn't. It was weak. And again, I always say when Israel was weak, that shows us that God was strong. That Israel survived through these empires. It is really shining a light on God and his purpose for the Israelites. But even though Israel is one of the smaller countries and weaker countries, her history has a major impact on the world. One of the subjects that I teach to honor students in high school is Western civilization. Now, we're all old enough that when we went through high school, that's the history that we studied when we weren't studying necessarily U.S. history. We were studying a Western Civ-based history. You guys remember that? History. And we got to teach them about China, and we got to teach them about India. And it was hard for me as a teacher because that wasn't my background. I sort of had to learn that on my own in order to teach it. Well, now I'm fortunate enough to be senior enough in my position where I teach that I get to pick and choose, and I let the other teacher have the world history, and I focus on the Western Civ. I happen to teach at a Biblical Worldview Academy. We teach from the perspective of the Bible is true. We are a ecumenical or non-denominational Protestant institution, even though we have some Catholic and occasionally some Orthodox students who join our classes. They understand that we come from a Protestant, Reformed Protestant perspective. And what I constantly teach my students is I feel so fortunate to be able to teach them Western Civ that starts in ancient Israel. Because most Western Civ classes, where do they start? Anybody remember what civilization? Greco-Roman world, right? You start in Greece and Rome. Well, God had a lot going on before that. And the non-biblical worldview academies don't look at ancient Israel because it's religious history, right? But what is developing in ancient Israel is something very, very different and very, very intentional by God. And this is a theme that's woven through the Old Testament rather subtly, but by the time you get to the New Testament, it's kicking you in the face. And it has to do sort of with that word exercise we did last week and the differences between the Old and the New Testament. The Old Testament and the history of Israel really begins to introduce this concept of a personal God, of a God that is, in Christianity we say, my Savior, my personal God, or I have a personal relationship with God. Don't ever say that in an Orthodox Jewish temple. It'll blow their minds. That you're arrogant. Who are you to have a personal relationship with God? We don't even say His name. We don't write it out. You ever seen in a Bible where they abbreviate Yahweh? They don't write it out. That's going from the old Jewish tradition of, oh, His name is too austere to be mentioned. You know, this was the guy in the Holy of Holies behind the curtain. Well, of course, the Jews don't follow the same Savior that we do. They kind of missed Him, and the veil was torn, and that whole paradigm of an impersonal, unapproachable, untouchable God is completely changed. Well, that is a theme that the Greek philosophers begin to write about. Aristotle wrote the famous question, and I'm going to paraphrase it here, what is my role in this world? Is what Aristotle said. That is the goal of every person, to figure out what is my role in this world. Augustine comes along several centuries later, a very early Christian theologian and philosopher, and takes Aristotle's question and changes it a little bit. Instead of what is my role in this world, Augustine looks at the very individualized question and says, what is God's role for me in this world? Both of them are highly individualized. Augustine adds God to the equation. That wouldn't have been accepted, even in the Roman world that Augustine was functioning in, but for the Greek philosophers laying the foundation, which wouldn't have made sense but for God revealing Himself to the ancient Israelites in a very individualistic way. And we're going to look at some of those individualistic ways that God reveals Himself through biblical figures like David and Solomon and some of the other. I love talking about Bathsheba. I don't know if you guys have ever done an in-depth study on Bathsheba. We're going to learn some things about Bathsheba and how significant of a biblical figure she is. And then we'll ask the question, naive victim or cunning manipulator? And I don't know the answer to that. You can draw your own conclusions, but it's a great question to ask about her, and we'll learn a lot of things about her. Israel's law contains God's standards for law. I turned in my PowerPoint probably a little earlier than I should have because I would have added a couple of pictures here. The basic principles, when observed, provide the guideline for Western lawmakers ever since the Ten Commandments, right? The basis of our Judeo-Christian morality and law codes. If you visit the United States Supreme Court building, which I was fortunate enough to do, probably 10 years ago now with a group of students, On the wooden door on the outside of the Supreme Court building, and this is the slide I would have shown you if I'd have remembered, there is two tablets with the Roman numerals 1 through 10. We all know what those are, right? Those are the 10 Commandments. At the peak of the building, in the very center, the most public place on that entire building is Moses sitting there holding the two tablets. Now, I was very disheartened because when we took the tour, inside the chamber, all around the ceiling, are carvings of significant people in the history of law. So you've got Hammurabi, you've got Napoleon. These aren't necessarily good people, right? But Hammurabi and Napoleon, and Moses is up there too. Justinian. All these great people in history who had an impact on the laws are on the building, or in the main chamber. But when you take a tour of the building, the tour guide has been trained to tell you that on the front door, that carving and 1 through 10 is the Bill of Rights. Now, we had pre-educated our students before we went to that tour, and our students were armed with evidence. Number one, the Bill of Rights have never been written in Roman numerals, okay? The Bill of Rights have never been chiseled onto stone tablets. They had quills back then, right? And perhaps most significantly, we challenged the poor tour guide, and he was just doing what he was trained to do, but I think we woke him up. We had the written letters from the Jewish architect who designed the building and told us he put the 10 Commandments on the front door and the 10 Commandments because it was the basis of all of our laws. And I guess in our politically correct society, they've chosen not to tell people that visiting the building the truth about that, and it's sad. But it does show the significant history that this society had on this society. And so when I get to teach ancient or Western Civ, I start really where God relates to people on an individual level. And Christianity, if you study Western Civ, you can't avoid studying the history of the church in some capacity. My class probably a little more than in public school. But that Christian history is woven through Western history, where when the Western Roman Empire collapses, there's really only one organized institution left standing in the entire Western world, the Catholic Church, right? And so it's integral. It's integral to understanding Western Civ, to understand this Judeo-Christian heritage and the morality and the standards and the laws that come from it. The Patriarch period itself is revealed mostly through the scriptural text. But of late, and I'm a historian, my definition of late is probably a whole lot different than your definition of late. I'm talking in the last 150 years, this whole sort of budding, started off as a pseudoscience, now it's a more accepted science of archaeology emerges. And so we begin to see what we call extra-biblical resources and evidence for so many things in the Bible. I try to always inspire my students to think like an archaeologist when we're looking at an ancient picture of modern picture of an ancient building, right? Tell them they can be like Indiana Jones and maybe earn their leather jacket if we look at this building and they tell me what information they can glean by looking at the building. With the advancement of archaeology, we found a lot of ancient texts that say some interesting things. Now, the minimalist, we learned what that was last week, right? Somebody who needs extra evidence to believe the Bible is true. The minimalist requires now this information in order to believe anything in the Bible is true, right? Oh, if we don't have the chariots of the Pharaoh from the Red Sea, then the Exodus didn't happen. Funny thing is, if you go on the internet and Google chariots of the Red Sea, there's images of them on the bottom of the ocean right now. It's kind of cool. But they require this archaeological extra biblical evidence. Jerusalem itself as a still inhabited city. I said, what, 4% excavated, 3 to 4% excavated? So we don't have all the we don't have more information than we do. But what's interesting about the archaeology, the minimalist wants the archaeology to definitively prove the biblical text. I always like to turn it around on them and say, does the archaeology disprove the biblical text? Because the archaeology is, quite frankly, so minimal. And 100% of the archaeology discovered that is relevant to the biblical text verifies it. We don't have any archaeological evidence. Nothing's ever been discovered that contradicts the existence of the people and the veracity of the stories that they're involved in from the Old Testament narrative. So I like to turn it around and hold them to their own standards, right? The traditional viewpoint of a scholar named Julius Wellhausen is that no reliable historical information about the patriarchs was available to bolster the Old Testament. Therefore, he rejects it. His view reigned unchallenged until discoveries of the ancient Near East began to fill the picture of ancient civilization, in which the activities of the patriarchs seemed to fit perfectly. Now, the patriarchs were basically nomadic herdsmen, right? They didn't leave a significant footprint in archaeology. So we don't necessarily have archaeology of, hey, this was Abraham's grocery list. We don't have that, right? But what we have from other societies who are recording their information or recording their history are scenarios that make the patriarch period make perfect sense, where previously they were challenged and dismissed as having no verifiable proof. As recently as 1972, conservative maximalists could say with confidence that most minimalists had been forced to accept the historicity of the biblical accounts. Discoveries at ancient sites like Mari and Nuzi, places you probably never heard of, found archaeological evidence that tended to verify the biblical text. Now, I have a really cool book here. It's called Old Testament Parallels, and it is an English translation of a bunch of ancient sources that archaeologists have uncovered. It's written by Dr. Victor Matthews, who's actually, I don't know if he still is, but he was the Dean of Humanities at Missouri State, ironically, a leading scholar in the prophets and in the Old Testament. He's got an amazing website if you ever want resources for the Old Testament. Just Google Victor Matthews and he'll give you every written source ever on his own website. Well, in Old Testament Parallels, there's several sources, and I want to read to you one called the Merneptah Stele. And I would have added a picture of this if I'd had thought of it in time, but I didn't think of it until yesterday. The Annals of Merneptah were found on a stele. A stele is a word for a stone, a tablet, right? A lot of times, like the Hammurabi Code was on a 7-foot stele that's in the Louvre Museum with 200 and some odd laws written on it. It's a big stone. They didn't have billboards. They used stones. So the Merneptah Stele dates back to the New Kingdom period of Egypt. And it is from about 1500 BC. So a little bit later than the Patriarch period, but 1500 BC. It is the first reference to the nation of Israel by non-Israelites. You see, it's not verifying the biblical text per se, but it's verifying the existence of Israel. And the minimalists don't like that very much. It's very interesting. It's that long, and here's the images on it. It says, the rulers of my enemies now lay prostrate before me and beg for peace. By the way, this is the Egyptian way of writing, and it's kind of like Chronicles, right? We can do no wrong, our kings are perfect. Not one of my enemies raises his head in revolt. I have devastated Tenahu and put down a revolt against the great king of Hatti. I've plundered Syria, Palestine from one end to the other and taken slaves from the city of Ashkelon. I've conquered the city of Gezer. I have razed Yenoam to the ground. I have decimated the people of Israel and put their children to death. Wow. Does that verify any biblical occurrence? Not necessarily directly. We've got a lot of stories about battles against Egyptians in the Bible, but it verifies Israel. And there's a whole bunch of references like that you can put together and start to piece together, even as far back as the Patriarch period, to verify that something like that likely could have happened. Dating, I put dating as difficult because it's kind of a catchy phrase, but that's not how I mean it. Dating events and people in the Old Testament is difficult. And my professor in this field said, you need to proceed with an air of caution, of great caution. I tried to bold this, but it messed with the spacing, so I'm going to read each one to you. There are numerous scholarly disagreements about dating the Old Testament. If you've even skimmed through Kaiser, you probably glean that he grabs onto this. When did Abraham's journey take place? Well, nowadays we kind of demand an exact date, right? But we don't have an exact date. And so in history, we like to use that C period, which means circa, about. Don't try it on your math homework, it won't work. Circa, about. So circa 2200 BC, 22nd century BC, is what most of the maximalist scholars have put the journey of Abraham, who left Ur and went to the Promised Land. But we don't know the date. Kaiser continues with this theme of laying out the scholarship and the various scholars who've advanced the various debates. And the debates are very interesting to people like me. I don't know that they would be overly interesting to non-history people. Note how the sources of others, like the Egyptian in the Merneptah stele, are often utilized to verify the existence of cities, of peoples, of events that we read about in passing in the Bible. How many times when you read in the Old Testament and you're either going through a genealogy and you're just like, just skim right through that, or you're going through a list of cities that this Pharaoh has conquered, and you're like, yep, never heard of that, yep. You do it all the time. Some people pay attention to those and break them down and verify their existence and verify if we have any written history from those people in order to verify the biblical text. It's actually a whole budding field out there called biblical archaeology. Who are considered patriarchs? Well, let's come over here to our handy board, and you guys did so well last week. When you hear the word patriarch, give me adjectives. What do you think of?
Senior.
Senior? Is that what you said? What else?
Head of household.
I would just do HH, but around here people think that means I put harder house. What else?
Lineage.
Lineage? Lineage?
All of the same family.
Another word we like to use for that. It's actually another term for this period. Some people call the patriarch period the ancestor period. What else? Oh, come on, we live in postmodern America. Is anybody offended? No? What might offended people say that the term patriarch means? Patriarchal or triggered. Male dominated. Somebody wanted to say it, you were just being too polite. Anything else? both spiritual and earthly or practical leadership. Patriarchal has an overly negative connotation in today's society. Is it necessarily negative? The Bible talks a lot about slavery too, doesn't it? We would all agree that slavery is a rather negative subject. But it was also a reality, wasn't it, in the world at the time? It was wrong, no doubt about it. God often deals with the realities in the world at the time to teach us lessons without changing those realities necessarily. I might also say this about patriarchy. I don't know if I was going to say it on a later slide or if I was going to say it now, but I'm going to go ahead and say it now. The Old Testament makes 371, somebody's actually counted, references, and this is just the Old Testament, to women. And I mean specific women, or a small group of women. You can study 50 years of ancient history, from Egypt, from the Assyrians, from the Hittites, from the Amalekites, you name all the strange names in the Bible. And I don't think in all of those societies you would hear about 371 women. And if you do hear about a woman, or a female character, a lot of times a goddess with a small g, right? It's usually in regard to her being a mother, a wife, a daughter, or some sort of sexual purpose, sexual prowess, because it's written by men, right? Doesn't that make the biblical text not only awesomely unique, but incredibly different as a source of history? It's not until thousands of years later that historians begin to write what's called a bottom-up history. The text of the Old Testament is very much a top-down history, the movers and the shakers in society, right? But it's also a bottom-up history because it not only talks about women, it names women. It often defines men through women. When we get to 1st and 2nd Kings, and this is one of those things you probably glossed over in reading those books before. They always say a couple of things in Kings, right? One of the things that we always remember is this guy becomes king in whatever year of his rival king, and he did what? He either did evil in the sight of the Lord, right? Or he walked in the way of his father David, right? Well, you may not have ever noticed. First of all the kings of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Only the kings of Judah, a few of them, 8 of them to be specific, walked in the way of their father David. But if that king was a good Jewish boy when he started out, he is introduced in the book of Kings as the son of his mother. Doesn't say his father. We know who his father is, was the last king. The son of his mother. Now, partly, that's because these kings had more than one wife, and you had to name the wife in order to, find the lineage. But more significantly, it's because in ancient Israel, a person's Judaism is determined by their matrilineal lineage through their mother's line. And there's a very simple reason for it. You can tell when a woman's pregnant, right? Especially around 8-9 months. It's very obvious. And next thing you know, she's got a baby. Well, they didn't have paternity tests in the ancient world. You couldn't tell who the father was unless the kid was a spitting image, Unless he came out with a beard, he wouldn't be the spitting image of his dad, but at least not for a while. But that's the reason that Judaism is determined, because it's the son of a Jewish woman. And that actually becomes very important as we start talking about the monarchy period, and we'll come back to that in a later lesson. But the point I want to make about women isn't that remarkable? Not only that God mentions women, but God develops the character of so many women. And women rise to positions in some constructs of Israel that other women in other societies almost never did. Can you think of any off the top of your head? Prominent women who rose to a position of prominence in society? The Amazon. Huh? I mean Jewish women in the Old Testament. Deborah, a judge. Yeah.
You can even make the argument that Eve is very prominent, because it says, in the image of God, he created man.
All right.
Male and female, he created
Them.
That is-
Yeah, it's plural. Because most creation narratives don't do that. In fact, I've never read another one that does, that puts such emphasis of egalitarian nature of man and women. So I want you to notice that about the Old Testament construct. So what is a patriarch? It's a term that means father, the male head of the family or tribe. We mentioned that. The male head of a society, of the human race. The word, of course, has become extremely controversial and in a very negative fashion in the modern world today. Patriarchal. It's almost like discrimination or discriminating. Bad word, right? Whereas just a generation ago, it used to be a good thing to have discriminating taste. I tell my students, are you going to discriminate on who you bring home to meet mom and dad and potentially marry someday? I hope you do. I hope you're discriminating. Now, I'm not saying based on, race, but hopefully based on gender, right? Hopefully based on belief and faith tradition. So we've taken words in our society today and really twisted them, and patriarchal is one of them. And they like to lump Israel, although they always blame Israel the most, with a bunch of other ancient societies that are overly patriarchal. Today they might say, it looked like the Taliban. And it didn't. It didn't at all. Let's talk about Abraham. Traditionally, when we're talking about the patriarchs, we're certainly talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's no question that we're talking about these three. Most scholars include Joseph, Jacob's son, one of 12 sons of Jacob, in the discussion of the patriarchs. Some scholars divide the Exodus period from the patriarch period. I choose not to do that, and I include the Exodus period in the patriarch period. And so some scholars say that Moses and, of course, Joshua are part of a different period. But I tend to include those along with sort of the founding fathers of Judaism, of ancient Israel and Judaism. But there is some debate about that. The only consensus is that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are there, because they're the first three. Abraham, as we know, and I said I'm not going to recount the stories, I'm going to rely that you have some biblical knowledge there, was called by God, and Abraham lived in a place called Ur. Ur was in Sumer, way down here in extreme southern Mesopotamia. Probably not far from where the Garden of Eden was. We don't have archaeological evidence of where the Garden of Eden was, but most think it was in extreme southern Mesopotamia. Here's the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. Mesopotamia means land between the rivers. Sumer was sort of the southern portion of Mesopotamia. And it was dominated by city-states. They weren't a cohesive nation. They didn't have a soccer team to cheer for. They didn't have the chiefs or anything. They had different kinds of chiefs. But they were governed sort of like ancient Greece would come to be governed, with Athens and Corinth and Sparta. They were these dominant city-states. And Abraham was from the city-state of Ur, which is probably because Abraham, the most well-known city-state. Another well-known city-state is a city called Urek, U-R-E-K. If you've ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is sort of the very first, or at least as far as we've discovered so far, the very first story written in human history. Everything in human history up to that point was usually like a legal contract, or I'm going to sell you 4 goats for, this many units of wheat or whatever. But by the time of Sumerian society, we get the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's an interesting story. I think the most interesting thing about it is that it is a story. And so we learn a little bit about this region, and Abraham is called by God to travel from Ur to Haran, which is up here. Now, we knew he's going over here, why didn't he just go this way? There's a camel, it's a dead giveaway. Bad idea. You need this water. Water is life. And so you need to go up along the water. He goes to Haran, and then eventually goes down, and he prays at places called Bethel and Shechem, which are right there by, this is the bigger sea is the Dead Sea. The smaller sea is the Sea of Galilee. The river that runs from the Sea of Galilee, which is a live lake, large sea. The Jordan River flows down into the Dead Sea, which is so salt concentrated nothing lives in it. But this is the area where Abraham is sent. He prays in Bethel. He sets up an altar. Then there's a famine. And Abraham, where do people go when famines hit in ancient Israel? They go to the place that never runs out of food. Jesus went there too when he was a boy, probably because of a drought. Moses' ancestors went there and were captured and enslaved. They go to Egypt because there's always food in Egypt. Egypt measured its wealth not in gold, although they had a lot of it. If you've ever seen King Tut's tomb or pictures of what they found there, they have a lot of gold. Egypt measured their wealth because they were an agrarian society by their reserves of food. And that bought them more power and more currency than all the gold in the world. Grain. Grain was huge. And so whenever there was a lull, the Tigris and Euphrates usually flood every year, but sometimes they stop. The Nile floods every year. You always can go down to the Nile and get your food. And that's why so many people in the Old Testament are migrating over towards Egypt for a time. Abraham and his people, his followers, were pastoral nomads. I like that term. They were country folk who took animals with them, and they traveled around. They lived in tents. That's why we don't have an archaeological footprint. Abraham would enter Canaan. We talked about what Canaan was last week. Canaan is the Israel, Philistia, and Phoenicia side of the Fertile Crescent. He enters Canaan, a Canaan that is very much in transition, according to biblical scholars. Canaan had been a land of some pretty powerful cities. Cities like Megiddo, Bethshan, Ai, Jericho, and a city called Lachish. You've probably heard of one or two of those, but they were very prominent cities. They were walled cities, meaning they had a fortified wall around them, which meant that they were desirable militarily for somebody else to come and take. Interesting tidbit of information. The oldest continually inhabited walled city in the world. Anybody want to take a guess?
Sienna, Italy.
Nope.
Jericho?
Not Jericho. They broke the wall down at Jericho. They had to build a new one. It's actually Damascus, which is the capital of Syria today. Probably a place you don't want to have on your bucket list to go visit anytime soon, but very interesting tidbit.
How old is it?
It dates back to 2000 BC. And so some of these cities would have been older, but they didn't survive. Jericho got destroyed and came back later, which is when Joshua crosses over. Jericho rebuilds its wall and comes back, and then they knock it down again. Sad story. Abraham, of course, interesting stories about Abraham. Abraham and women. He marries an arranged marriage, surely they all were back then. Anybody remember his wife's name? First wife? Sarah? Sarah, right? And anybody know how he met Sarah? They had the same dad. He kind of knew her a long time. She was a half-sister. And, of course, They don't have a baby for a long time. Sarah is one of our stories of infertility. And, of course, in the ancient world, they take infertility as a sign from you are not good with God. And perhaps, some biblical scholars have opined, perhaps they believe that was because she was too closely related by blood. But ultimately, they get the job done and have children, and Isaac, of course, is the next in line. Isaac is an interesting character. Oh, before I jump to Isaac, I wanted to show you this. This was actually discovered in the 1920s and 30s by a British archaeologist named Sir Leonard Woolley. It's located in modern-day Iraq. I showed you on the map where Ur was. This is called the ziggurat of Ur. This was the temple. This building, it had been renovated in the 1500s BC, they think, but most of this building was there when Abraham was in Ur. So I like to show this to my students, like, this is a really, really old building, and Abraham probably walked up those steps because he used to practice the polytheistic religion of Ur. And at the top here, it no longer exists. Anybody know what would have been at the top? Closest to the gods? The temple, where they practiced their religion. The rest of the building was used for storage of records and administrative things, and it was the main, thing in the town. But at the top was a temple, and you can kind of see that it's in ruins there. This is really interesting because this is the only ziggurat that is this intact that still exists. There's another very famous ziggurat in the Bible. Anybody want to venture a guess what we call that one? It was in the middle of the town. It was a tall, sort of pyramidal building. It was in Babylon. It was a tower. There we go. It's the Tower of Babel. A ziggurat was, it's sort of a generic term for a polytheistic, nature-worshiping house of worship, center of town, administrative center. And they were in every city of ancient Sumer and many other ancient Near Eastern towns that practiced these nature religions. There were ziggurats in Syria to their deities, Ashur. There was temples to Baal in Canaan. They weren't quite as elaborate as this. This thing is 6 stories tall, by the way. I mean, I should have put a little dude next to it. He'd probably be about this big next to it. It's a huge, huge building.
It looks clean.
It was buried by sand for well over 1,000 years. And the British archaeologists and toothbrushes and a whole bunch of people cleaned it off in 6 stories and found the whole thing, yeah.
Do you have any idea how tall the temple would have been on top of that?
Probably another story, maybe 2. The priests would have lived there. There probably was a place for priestesses because many of these ancient polytheistic religions were so warped in on the issue of fertility and having children that if a couple couldn't have a children, they'd kind of help you out by providing somebody. We see that often in the biblical narrative, don't we? With Hagar or whoever, where somebody fills in and I'll have your baby, I'll be your surrogate. That's how important having children was in these polytheistic societies, because then God was considered to be in favor of the man, right? And it absolutely defined womanhood. If a woman couldn't have a child, she was almost ostracized and shunned from society. We actually know the least about Isaac. I'll come back to that. Isaac is just in a few short chapters in Genesis, and he's the least that we know about. And ironically, he lived the longest. He lived longer than Abraham or Jacob did. He really takes no daring action or exploits that we know of. He's known primarily as either the son of Abraham or the father of Isaac. He lived longer than Abraham or Jacob. He, like Abraham, lied about the identity of his wife to protect her from the Philistines, who are often called the sea people in the Bible. Isaac is very successful in Philistia. God confirms the covenant with Isaac that he made with Abraham. Another common theme we see with Isaac is that his wife would conspire, this is significant, his wife would conspire to have a younger son receive the blessing. Where else have we seen that in Scripture? I wrote Bathsheba there, but where else? Bathsheba conspires for Solomon to get the blessing. We'll go way back. Well, right. And we see it with Jacob and Esau, obviously, where Rebekah conspires to get Isaac, who she had identified. Again, here we have the significance of a woman. Dad's just kind of, doesn't know what's going on. Mom knows exactly every nuance of every kid, right? She knows his mannerisms. She knows everything about this kid. And Mom decides Isaac is the better one to get the blessing. Isaac is the better one to inherit. And Mom was right. Not surprised. Mom knew exactly what she was doing. Let me go back to Abraham, see if we missed any points on Abraham. Abraham, those who lived in the area of Jerusalem prior to the Jews' arrival were known as the Jebusites. Abraham actually predates, as far as we can tell, Abraham predates anything in Jerusalem. It wasn't there. No Jebusites, no nothing. He arrives at Shechem, which is 35 miles from where Jerusalem will be, and it's where God tells him, to your offspring I will give this land. And so he's pretty close, right to the hub of it all in Jerusalem when God gives him that command. His near sacrifice of Isaac takes on new meaning within the context of God setting Israel apart. Remember, that was a theme we talked about last week. Setting them apart from Canaan. Canaan did practice human sacrifice. God absolutely forbids it, and he does that through the example of Isaac. Ultimately, God will do the sacrificing for us, but the Jews, of course, would not have seen that foretelling as of yet. Abraham had to search for a non-Canaanite wife for Isaac. And he went, kind of backtracked, almost all the way back to Ur to find Rebekah. A servant went to Haran in order to find Rebekah, and it was considered a good match. This is another where I actually showed you the picture of a text. This is called the Ebla tablet. This is actually one of 1,800 tablets that have been discovered by archaeologists in what is today Syria. There are an additional 4,700 fragments. This one was discovered by the Italians. Therefore, most of them are in museums in Rome. Some of the interesting artifacts, whatever country the archaeologists represented wound up with the artifacts. And so we've got a lot of artifacts from ancient Israel in Germany, in England, in France, and in Italy. There's actually a kind of a big debate going on right now, particularly as it pertains to the Egyptians who said, give us our stuff back. We want our history back. And I think, kind of makes sense. Now, the Iraqis are saying, give us our stuff back. And then ISIS steals it and sells it. So that stuff's not going to go back. But in Egypt, I think they have a pretty strong argument in international courts that they should have Tut back. The Ebla text is remarkable because it makes specific references to places that are referenced in the Bible and give context to Abraham and David. It specifically mentions about the Bible by verifying these same places that are referenced in the biblical text, sometimes for the first time, like in the instance of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is the earliest reference to Sodom and Gomorrah outside of the Bible that's like, aha, there's some truth, there's a kernel of truth to that story for the minimalist. To us, it's like very verifying.
I just want to double down on what you're saying. There was a whole century of scholarship in the 1800s where scholars would come forward and say, there was never a Sodom and Gomorrah. There was never an Assyrian Empire because the only source of history we have for it is the Bible until all this archaeological evidence disproved all of, you have to burn half of the historical textbooks from the 19th century because they were just making those assertions and the minimalist approach was ridiculous.
Well, and to add on top of that, you have to ask the question, why not? the biblical text. Take it outside of its context of a theological book if you want to do that. Take it in the context of an ancient writing that has been verified and challenged more than any book in human history and has never been disproven. In fact, no kernel of it has been disproven by this, newfangled science of archaeology. And why don't you accept the biblical text as at least a possible reliable source? Well, that's because it's religious. Well, yeah, it is. But it goes back to my lunch with Dr. Cooper at Missouri State, the Egyptologist. Don't you wish you had a source like the Bible for ancient Egypt? And he just started gushing. And this is a Jewish guy. He just started gushing. Oh boy, because not only because of all the detail that it gives, that it has basically been inflappable for thousands of years, but because it also gives a very negative history. The Bible doesn't read like that Merneptah Stele, does it? Where David just said, well, Chronicles does on purpose. But you read Kings and it doesn't read like we conquered our enemies and we did everything perfectly and we were great. It reads like, where did we go wrong? We screwed up again and again and again and again. And the biggest and most powerful screwed up in David and Solomon. Jacob, who of course is given the name Israel, a twin with Esau. Jacob was younger. Survival and inheritance rights in Judaism. Very interesting topic. Another area that was uncontested was that in the ancient world, the oldest son always had the right to inherit. At least half of the estate, a majority of the estate, always went to the oldest son. Well, they will use that supposed knowledge to argue that, well, the Bible's wrong. The Bible can't be true because they're not following the rules of the ancient Near East where the inheritance always went at least half to the eldest son. How many incidents in the Old Testament can we name where it wasn't the eldest son who inherits the throne or inherits the sheep or inherits the herd or inherits the shack, whatever? How many? David, Solomon, Gideon, Jacob. We can go on and on and on, can't we? Where God doesn't follow the rules of the world. But what's really cool is when archaeologists find something that verifies, okay, maybe that was not a hard and fast rule throughout all of the ancient world. And that's where these discoveries at the Nuzi archives come in. Another group of discoveries, 150 miles north of Baghdad in northeastern Iraq. It was a city that flourished during the late Bronze period and was destroyed by the Assyrians. Welcome to the club. Nuzi was excavated 1920 to 1930 by an Englishman, and some 3,500 tablets were collected from the house of the governor, written in ancient Akkadian, one of the earliest written languages, actually. They're a dialect of Akkadian spoken very similar to the language that would develop called Aramaic, which is what Jesus spoke on a daily basis. The Nuzi archives offer illuminating parallels for political, economic, legal, and social institutions in the stories of Abraham and Sarah, and in the stories of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. For example, talking about in patrilineal cultures like the Nuzi in ancient Israel, the land and the children of a household were inherited by the males related to the father of the household. The beloved son, which is a sort of cross-cultural reference, the oldest son or heir received the status, received the household, is most marriageable to women, and is most necessary to have children. Well, in Nuzi, they discovered 4 examples in Akkadian where that didn't happen. Now, does that reference the Bible directly? No. But we've got parallel incidents to the exact same thing that Abraham did with Sarah, the exact same thing that Jacob would receive the inheritance over Esau. The exact same thing that David, when Samuel shows up at Jesse, David's dad's house, and says, line up your sons, I got to pick the next king, and I've been told that he comes from your sons, and he goes down the line, and he looks at, Jesse probably had 6 or 7 sons, and he's going down the line, nope, and he goes down the whole line, and he goes, where is he? You're hiding one. Oh, well, that's the least. That's David. He's tending to the sheep. He's off in the field, picking up goat crap. He's the lowest of the low. Why do you want to talk to him? And what does Samuel do? I want David. He's the one, right? And so God does that again and again with younger men, younger boys who aren't supposed to inherit. He does it with women. He just breaks all the rules, and that really confounds a lot of minimalist scholars for a lot of years. Because when they're not playing by the same rules as the ancient Near East, then it surely can't be true. Well, as we look at it, it's more evidence of Israel being set apart. It's more evidence of God saying, you're different, you're special, you're mine, and we're going to do it completely differently. The problem is the Israelites don't want to do it differently, and they whine like spoiled children half the time. Joseph, as I mentioned, I include Joseph with the patriarchs as one of Jacob's 12 sons. God chose to only give us selected narratives of selected people. We don't know anything about the rest of Jacob's sons, do we? Maybe a name, but that's about it. Of course, he has the faith of Abraham, the gentleness of Isaac, and the courage of Jacob. He's sort of the embodiment of all of his lineage. He's sold into Egypt. As I mentioned, how does the Bible deal with slavery? Well, it deals with slavery as a real condition at the time. God could have just said it's eliminated, but that's not what he did, because he lets us just keep sinning away. Sale by his brothers indicates the importance of the male sibling rivalry for favor and inheritance. We see that constantly in the ancient world, don't we? One prince killing off another prince so that he can be the sole survivor, the standing heir. God puts many in proximity to do great things. Joseph in the proximity to Pharaoh. David in the proximity to Saul, who's a king. And God knows that he's going to work through these people in different ways. I want to talk about the Exodus a little bit. I am going to be a lot shorter today than I was last week on purpose. I'm going to try to keep it about an hour. Exodus, one of the pinnacle events in the Bible, right? We've all studied the Exodus ever since little kids in Sunday school. There's a controversy about the date of the Exodus and how long it lasted. The old thinking, and by old thinking I'm talking 50 to 100 years ago, placed it in the 13th century during the reign of Pharaoh Ramses II. And that's where Hollywood places it too, right? Whenever you see the Ten Commandments or more recent adaptations. It's always Ramses, Yul Brynner or whoever else is playing Ramses. But oddly, the consensus, at least among maximalist scholars today, is that the Exodus actually took place more than 200 years before Ramses II ever becomes Pharaoh. Probably during the reign of a guy named Thutmose III, and probably during the reign of a couple of pharaohs. There's a great debate, and Kaiser gets into it a little bit. You can read it about it if you want. And it has to do with how do we date things. Now, it's particularly hard. It goes back to my dating is difficult. It's particularly hard in the Old Testament when Hebrew didn't have any numbers, right? That makes it really hard. But translators have added numbers to the Old Testament, and we can, from their numbers, generally ascertain from the date that we know for certain. For certain in history means within 100 years, right? That's the building of the temple during the reign of Solomon. Solomon comes to the throne roughly circa 900 BC. So we know that the temple is built right around the end of the 10th century, beginning of the 9th century BC. And then you can look at the chronology of the Old Testament, and you can date it back, the Exodus. You can date it back usually to the 15th century, or around 1446 is the date that a lot of the maximalist scholars are putting on the Exodus to the best of their ability. We often attempt to correlate Israel's history with Egypt in this regard. For a long time, Ramses II. New scholarship shows much earlier. How big was the Exodus? Well, there were 600,000 men over 20 years old. It's kind of like the feeding of the 5,000, right? We get a number. But that number, what was the 5,000? It was the 5,000 adult men. And so they had big families in ancient Israel. They had as many kids as they could possibly create. So you can extrapolate whatever number you want from roughly 600,000 men or the feeding of the 5,000 men as to how many it actually fed or how many actually went on the Exodus. 4 times that number? 5 times that number? Another important event during the Exodus, of course, is the parting of the sea. Why was that necessary? I think, and many scholars think, that the Israelites need an extremely strong impression of the greatness of Yahweh after being so many years in absolute desperation in Egypt. And God, on occasion, God just brings the show, right? He does it with the parting of the Red Sea. We're going to go through the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, probably in a way that you've never heard it before. I don't know, with Mark it might be possible. But in a very kind of off the beaten path way, and we're going to have a lot of fun with it, but God just comes up so big and puts on a huge show for the people, because at times people needed to see it. It makes me kind of wonder, do we need, I mean, we live in Branson, do we need a big show from God in order to get people to come around and quit turning their backs on him? I don't know, I'm not in charge of that, but I think it would be nice. I pulled this chart offline. You can find all sorts of charts like this, and this is one example that I want to share with you today of, let's try to understand it like the ancients would have understood it. Because we read about the 10 plagues, and you just think there's these off the beaten path, that, the plagues of water turning to blood, frogs, lice, flies, disease on cattle, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the death of the firstborn. But if you look at this chart, I ask you the question, did you ever realize that in each of the plagues, God is specifically defeating a nature deity of the Egyptians? Do you think the Egyptians would have respected the power of Yahweh when they see one by one several of their gods being defeated? Of course, they're defeated because they didn't exist, but he's taking on very publicly the gods of Egypt. And here we've got a neat list of the gods. Of course, Egypt had hundreds of gods, and they would welcome gods from whoever they conquered and fold them into their pantheon. And so we've got Egyptian and quasi-Egyptian gods being attacked. They had a god of frogs that was related to fertility. What's one of the first things you hear in the springtime when the ponds get full? That's kind of why they have a god. And a frog is like a sacred symbol. You'll find frogs in jewelry in ancient Egypt. Lice, taking on Seb, the earth god. Flies, they had a fly god. That's how twisted they were. I think the fly god is called Satan, but... a disease on cattle. Cattle is the very symbol of fertility. Egyptian gods, 4 Egyptian gods are associated with bulls and cows, and God makes them all sick and die. That'll wake them up, right? Hail, Nut, the Egyptian sky goddess, Isis and Seth, the Egyptian agricultural deities, and Shu, the Egyptian god of the atmosphere. This is very similar to what God does with Elijah against the prophets of Baal. At the end of a drought, God brings the rain. Says, you're God of the rain, Baal, whatever you want to call him. He didn't bring the rain. But at the end, after Elijah defeats all the prophets, what's he do? He brings the rain. At the end of a drought. Do you think the people who were watching that show realized what God was doing and realized who had the power? We know they did because the Bible says they went straight down. They just, whoa, that's too awesome. I'm sure we would if we saw a show like that. We'd just get down and be afraid, be freaked out or whatever. And the last one is significant. The death of the firstborn. That's kind of the plague that is most remembered, right? Where Pharaoh kills the heir to the throne. God kills Pharaoh's heir to the throne. Well, in ancient Egypt, the Pharaoh was considered a god. And so he's defeating the last of their gods by killing off the Pharaoh's son. And here's something really interesting. Probably in light of what we've been talking about, not surprising though. There is not one Egyptian reference to any of this anywhere. There wouldn't be. This is bad, negative history for Egypt, right? Horrible, horrible thing. They're not going to record it, and they didn't record it. But we found it recorded in a couple other societies' text references, just vaguely, as the plagues, the pox upon Egypt, or the plagues that were descended upon Egypt by Israel, mentioned by name. So again, we've got extra biblical sort of nuggets that give a kernel of truth to the Bible that at minimum defeat the minimalist point of view. And at maximum, get us a step towards extra biblical verification, which isn't necessary but is really fun. The route of the Exodus is also something that is highly debated. In most translation, it's called the Red Sea, right? It might have been the Reed Sea, another little sea up here. Another thing that threw off the date of the Exodus so long is because in the Bible it says they came up out of Ramses to Succoth. Oh, well, Ramses had to have been Pharaoh if there's a city named Ramses. And so they assumed that it was the late period. Well, archaeology has revealed that there was actually an ancient city called Ramses, there was a Ramses the first, that's Ramses the second. They were both named after the city. And so that just threw everything on its head. It's like, oh, we found archaeology showing an ancient city of Ramses. But this is probably the most well-known route of the Exodus. There I go again. They come across, they go around the Sinai Peninsula, which is mostly desert, and of course they cling to the water because it was actually very dangerous to go this way with Bedouin tribes. And of course, one of the places that we know they visit is Mount Sinai. I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of Mount Sinai. It's the kind of thing that I ask Google about all the time because I'm a nerd. This is the picture of Mount Sinai today, and you'll notice there's a building there. That building is actually called St. Catherine's Monastery. This was a site that was frequented by many early monastics who desired to be hermits. The monastical term for that is eremitical monasticism. That's where the word hermit comes from. It just basically means we're going to separate ourselves from the world in order to pray for the world. It's actually kind of a beautiful notion. And St. Anthony, been sainted by both the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, is widely believed to have been the first monk. And he would go off into the wilderness and try to hide so that he could attain what's called theosis, this idea of oneness with God, which is, of course, unattainable until we die, but doesn't mean it shouldn't try. And that's what they do. They go off and seek this oneness with God. Well, everybody sees Anthony doing this, like, that's cool, we want to do that. Well, that kind of ruins your hermit buzz. When people are following you around in the desert and knocking on your cave door and saying, we want to be like you. And he's like, leave me alone. And so they ultimately will come up with a new form of monasticism called cenobitical monasticism, or living in communities that are still separated from society. But this was a very early monastery that's been named after Catherine, St. Catherine, located at a site where it's widely considered where Moses came down from the mountain and found, the orgy party craziness going on and the golden calf and all the nutty stuff. And so they built a monastery there. There's really no other reason to go there because, look, it's horrible looking. Justinian ordered the monastery in the name of Catherine, an early martyr of the church. Justinian was a 6th and 7th century Roman emperor in Constantinople, Eastern Byzantine Empire. He ordered the monastery in her name much later, supposedly commemorating the site where Moses brought the commandments down from the mountain.
Just an interesting little
Catholic friends, and they pray to St. Anthony
If you
if you lose something.
if you lose something.
Like Mike lost his phone, and they said, oh, you need to pray for St. Anthony.
I need to start praying for St. Catherine because I'm losing a lot of things lately. But
Had anybody else heard that? Yeah, that's one of their saints they pray for, which that's so interesting. They wanted to be a hermit. I mean, it's like, where did they get the finding, except you said they knocked on the door.
and it may be a different Anthony. It may be a different Anthony. I don't know.
I think that makes sense. So
Yeah.
I'm going to ask my Catholic friends.
It's just so much easier just to remember you can pray to Jesus for everything.
Yeah, right. We don't need intercessory saints, and that we're all saints. That's what the Bible says, right? Who's a saint? We're all saints. We don't have to die and go through a trial in order to be beatified. We're beatiful while we're here on earth, so we don't have to follow those rules. Little summary of the Patriarch era. Probably the least hard-hitting, one of the lesser interesting time periods, simply because our information is rather limited. Anybody have any questions or comments?
Where does the Dead Sea Scrolls come in verification?
Great question. The Dead Sea Scrolls were uncovered at a place called Qumran. Let me go back. This isn't the best map for that, but it's on there. Go back to this Route of Abraham map that I had. The Dead Sea, as I mentioned, is this lower sea here. The caves of Qumran were on the western shore of the Dead Sea. And a group, a sect, is what they called them in the ancient world, called the Essenes or the Essenes, there's different pronunciations for it, decided they wanted to get out of the city and get out of the bureaucratic nightmare that was the temple. And they wanted to worship. It was sort of like establishing their own Acts church before Acts was written, right? But they wanted to get out and they wanted to just do their own thing and be separated. And so they formed this sect of scholars, and they wrote on some on papyrus, some on animal skins, and rolled them up in scrolls and put them in these clay jars and put them in these caves that were like a perfect 60 degrees. It was in the desert, so the moisture was not like caves around here. There's no creeks running through them. It was the perfect environment to preserve these texts. Well, these texts are discovered really beginning in the 1920s and through the 1950s, and they start to take them to, the basement of all these great museums around the world, where the really, really nerdy scholars who sit there and decipher language start to decipher them, and lo and behold, the Dead Sea Scrolls are 98% plus a direct translation of most of the books of the Old Testament in Hebrew. And today they are actually the oldest Hebrew text of the Old Testament in human possession. Now, prior to that, it was a book called the Septuagint, which is actually in Greek and was older, but it was it's not older than the Septuagint, but it's the oldest Hebrew text, which is the original language it was written in. And scholars were just amazed at how over the centuries and over the millennium, really, the translations had adhered to this text, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are written around the time of Christ. I mean, 1st century BC, really near the time of Christ. In fact, there's kind of a splinter group of scholars that believe that at least opine that when Jesus went to the desert, he may have went and hung out with the Essenes. Now, I'm not saying that from a theological standpoint, because there's theologically no verification of that in the Bible. But it is a thesis, I guess, of a group of scholars because the Essenes were. Now, women went with them, and they had communities there. It was an entire group, so it wasn't like ancient monks, but they would have had a group of scholars known as rabbis to lead them and to preserve their text.
They've even found, as I understand, the Ten Commandments.
Well, it's in the Old Testament, yeah.
There's a little shard that even references Genesis, where it says that
It is a large portion of the Old Testament. The only book that there's nothing from is Esther. And Esther was kind of a controversial book to include in the Old Testament. Huh? She isn't in the Catholic Bible? Well, the Apocrypha is not the Catholic Bible. The Apocrypha is 14 books of the Catholic Bible in addition to our Bible.
Esther's in our Bible.
Esther's in our Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah. It'll take you 8.5 minutes to read the whole book. It's like 4 pages. In fact, in a later lesson, I'm going to freak your freak about Esther. I'm going to give you some lessons about Esther that are going to be really interesting. Dead Sea Scrolls, oh boy, that is such a fascinating subject. Got to see a piece of one. They did a traveling Bible history museum that came to Springfield a few years ago, and I took a group of students there, and there was a few shards of the Dead Sea Scrolls that kind of go on tour. It was really cool. But a very important piece of archaeology, and that one doesn't have a kernel of biblical truth to it. That's the Bible. I mean, it's the Old Testament. It's fascinating. All right, next week, Judges. I've given you a handout, and for the benefit of those who are watching online, next week we're going to do the Judges period and just read chapters 12 and 13 of the Kaiser book. It's still a little bit heady because Judges is a little bit abstract. Not as tough as the first several chapters. By the time we get to the United Monarchy in week 4, that's when it gets really, really interesting and, quite frankly, a lot more biblical in how we examine it. Yep. Thanks for coming. I didn't quite do